Hey guys, tonight we begin with a winter problem that looks like good news until you put your hand beneath the bedding. Outside a Blackfeet teepee near the Rocky Mountain front, the air has suddenly softened. Snow is shrinking. Water is beginning to move along the ground. After days of hard cold, a warm downslope wind has arrived, and the obvious reaction is relief. The less obvious reaction is to check the floor. That is where this story becomes more interesting than the familiar claim that a teepee was simply warm in winter and cool in summer. A teepee could manage air, smoke, wind, and radiant heat with remarkable efficiency, but it did not float above the earth. Everyone inside still slept, sat, cooked, worked, and stored possessions only a few inches above soil that might be frozen at sunset, damp by midnight, and hard again after the warm wind passed. The roof could shed weather. The floor had to negotiate with it. And honestly, a sudden thaw is a very historical kind of gift. It arrives smiling, ruins your bedding, and leaves before anyone can complain. If you enjoy quiet history built from ordinary objects and unexpectedly complicated weather, please like the video, subscribe, and comment with the place where you are listening tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the broad country east of the northern Rocky Mountains before reservation boundaries restricted Blackfeet movement. Winter camps were chosen with practical knowledge of shelter, fuel, water, grazing, and game. River valleys and wooded places could offer protection that the open plains did not. Yet no site could make weather perfectly obedient. Cold air could settle, wind could hammer the lodge cover, then a dry, descending wind from the mountains could raise the temperature with startling speed and begin eating into the snow. Today these winds are usually called Chinooks. The historical Blackfeet world did not require a modern meteorological diagram to recognize what such a change meant. People living through repeated winters knew the signs in the sky, the direction of the wind, the feel of the air, and the response of snow underfoot. That knowledge was lived rather than displayed on a forecast screen. It guided decisions about travel, horses, fuel, clothing, and the small domestic landscape inside each lodge. The teepee itself was a controlled opening in the weather. Poles formed the cone, a hide covering, and later, often canvas, turned wind and precipitation aside. Smoke flaps helped manage the draft above a central fire. An interior lining, when used, created another layer between the people and the outer cover. Air entering low around the lodge could rise between lining and cover, encouraging smoke to move upward, rather than wander freely through sleeping faces. The system was adjustable, because the wind was adjustable too, usually without asking permission. But the ground required a different set of materials. Surviving descriptions from the plains mention grass, hides, robes, mats, and bedding arranged around the lodge interior, although exact practices differed across communities, households, seasons, and periods. Blackfeet-specific records do not preserve a neat instruction manual for every winter floor. That missing manual matters. Much of the knowledge belonged to repeated household work, the kind outsiders often noticed only when they wanted to describe an object, not when they wanted to credit the person who kept it dry. A useful floor began with separation. Bare earth pulls warmth from a resting body, especially when clothing and bedding are compressed beneath its weight. A loose plant layer could hold still air. Hides and thick robes could add warmth above it. The bed was therefore more than a soft place. It was a small thermal structure assembled inside a larger thermal structure. The central fire warmed bodies and nearby objects, but it did not erase contact with the ground. Anyone who has slept on cold soil learns that lesson through the hip first. Among Blackfeet families, women carried much of the labor connected with lodge ownership, erection, hide preparation, furnishing, cooking, and the ordering of domestic space. That does not mean every task followed one unchanging rule, or that men and children never helped. It means that the comfort modern viewers may attribute to the clever shape of the teepee also depended on skilled, repeated work. Someone selected materials, someone spread them, someone noticed a damp edge, someone moved a robe before moisture travelled farther beneath it. The Chinook complicated this arrangement because insulation can protect against cold while also hiding water. Snow packed outside the lodge might begin to soften. Frozen soil near the perimeter could turn wet before the deeper ground changed. Meltwater followed tiny slopes invisible beneath bedding. Boots and moccasins carried dampness through the entrance. Warm air inside met colder surfaces, adding another reason to watch where moisture gathered. A layer that felt comfortably thick during steady cold could become troublesome if it stayed wet. We should be careful here. The records do not allow us to announce one universal Blackfeet response, performed in exactly the same order whenever a Chinook arrived. Families were not following a single printed design. Available grass, robes, hides, trade cloth, campsite drainage, household size, and the strength and duration of the thaw all changed the problem. What can be said safely is that a mobile household made constant judgments about its materials, and those judgments separated warmth from dampness, usable bedding from spoiled bedding, and a manageable night from a miserable one. The first response may have been less dramatic than the title suggests. There was no emergency lever marked Rocky Mountain Wind. There was observation. A hand pressed near the edge of a robe. A sleeping place was kept away from the busiest path between door and fire. Wet footwear did not improve matters by wandering through the bedding. Loose material could be renewed when available, while damp pieces could be shifted, aired, or kept from direct contact with the body. The important skill was not owning one magical insulator. It was recognizing when each layer had stopped doing the job expected of it. That distinction changes how we should picture the Tipi floor. It was not a finished floor in the modern sense. It was an arrangement with a lifespan. Grass flattened, hides absorbed moisture, robes collected dirt, snow, sparks, hair, food fragments, and the evidence of people living close together. Each layer had to be judged by touch and use. Comfort emerged from maintenance, and the warm wind was still moving along the lodge edge. Yesterday's powder could darken into wet soil. Near the centre, the fire remained welcome, but more heat was not automatically the answer. Too much fire consumed fuel, increased smoke if the draft was poorly set, and could not dry a soaked layer instantly. The household therefore faced a quiet balance. Preserve warmth, encourage drying, protect bedding, and remain ready for the cold that might return as suddenly as the thaw had arrived. Beneath all of this lay one ordinary material, perhaps grass, perhaps another available plant layer, compressed under hides and human weight. At the beginning of the night it seemed like insulation. By morning, it might be a warning. The floor was already telling the family what the wind had changed. Its message began at the edge, where a dark line could appear beneath a robe before anyone felt wetness on the surface. The top layer might still seem warm. The underside told a different story. Once moisture entered the loose grass or other plant material below, the floor stopped behaving like a blanket and began behaving more like a cold sponge with excellent manners. It waited quietly until someone lay down. That simple change explains why floor insulation could never be treated as a permanent installation. The materials worked because they trapped air and kept bodies away from direct contact with the ground. Pressure gradually reduced that protection. People sat on the same places, children crossed between sleeping spaces and the fire, and bedding settled under repeated use. Even during steady cold, a family had reason to lift, shake, rearrange, or replace what had flattened. A Chinook merely shortened the time available for noticing. Surviving accounts of Blackfeet domestic life are much better at telling us that robes, hides, lodge furnishings, and grass bedding existed than at recording every ordinary act of maintenance. Outsiders often described a teepee after entering it as though the interior had arranged itself 5 minutes before their arrival. The hands that gathered material, softened hides, carried bedding, and kept the sleeping places usable could disappear from the written description. This is one of those moments when the missing labour is almost easier to see than the recorded object. The thick buffalo robe represented far more than something warm to pull over the shoulders. Its usefulness depended on the season of the hide. the work invested in preparing it, and the demands already placed upon it. A robe could serve as clothing, bedding, a seat, protection during travel, and an item of exchange. Using one beneath a sleeper protected the body from the floor, but it also exposed a valuable object to dirt, dampness, sparks, and wear. Comfort had a material cost, and households did not possess identical supplies. A family with several good robes could arrange warmth differently from one managing fewer or more worn pieces. A household with small children, an older relative, or someone unwell might distribute the best bedding according to need, though the surviving evidence rarely preserves the private discussion behind such choices. We should not invent a perfectly generous household or a perfectly strict rule. It is enough to notice that insulation was shared property under pressure. Every extra layer beneath one body was a layer unavailable somewhere else. Near the entrance, the pressure was different. The doorway opened low, and anyone entering brought some portion of the weather with them. Snow clung to footwear and clothing. During a thaw, that snow became water before it could be brushed away as easily. The path from the entrance toward the hearth therefore mattered. A sleeping place too close to that traffic received repeated small deliveries of dampness, which is a very efficient system if the goal is to make everyone mildly unhappy by bedtime. The central fire created another gradient. Close to it, warmth was stronger, but so were sparks, smoke, movement, cooking, and the risk of damaging hides or cloth. Farther away, the floor could be colder, especially near the outer edge. The interior was not one temperature. It was a series of small zones that shifted with the fire, the wind, the number of people inside, and the way the smoke flaps and lining were adjusted. The lining deserves attention because it helped connect the floor to the air above it. In many plains teepees, an inner liner rose from near ground level around part of the lodge. Air entering beneath the outer cover could travel upward between the liner and the cover, supporting the draft toward the smoke opening. The liner also reduced direct drafts against people seated or sleeping near the wall. Blackfeet teepees used such controlled airflow, but dimensions and materials changed over time, especially as canvas and trade cloth became available. That air movement could help carry smoke and some moisture upward, yet it was not a modern ventilation system with a switch labelled dry bedding. If the wind changed direction, the smoke flaps required attention. If the fire burned poorly, smoke might descend. If the ground released moisture during a thaw, the household still had to manage the materials touching it. Architecture made the work possible. It did not remove the work. Picture one sleeping place along the lodge wall. Beneath it lies a plant layer that creates separation from the earth. Above that are hides or robes arranged for padding and warmth. The person resting there adds weight, compressing the layers. Along the outer edge, colder air and damp ground press inward. From the centre, firelight and heat reach outward unevenly. The sleeping place is therefore caught between two climates only a few feet apart. A modern mattress hides most of this negotiation. Its thickness remains roughly the same through the night. The bedroom floor usually stays dry, and the weather is expected to remain outside. The teepee floor made no such promise. Its advantage was flexibility. Materials could be moved, inspected, aired, packed, and rebuilt. The same quality that made the household portable also allowed it to respond to changing conditions. Nothing was fixed, which meant almost everything was adjustable. Children would have learned this geography through ordinary correction. Do not step there with wet footwear. Keep that robe away from the fire. Move closer, but not so close that sparks become a new family problem. Such instructions are not preserved word for word, and we should not pretend they are. Yet every mobile household passes practical knowledge through repeated action. A child learns where warmth lives by being moved, warned, handed a task, or watching an older person test the bedding with a palm. Women's expertise was especially important because preparing and maintaining lodge materials sat within a much larger workload. Hides had to be processed, clothing needed repair, food had to be prepared and protected, fuel had to be managed. The lodge might have to be taken down, transported, and raised again when the band moved. Floor maintenance was therefore not a charming extra domestic ritual. It competed with many other necessary tasks, all of which became harder when the weather behaved unpredictably. The sudden warmth could also mislead the body. After severe cold, a milder wind felt generous. People could loosen clothing, move more freely, or enjoy relief from the sharpest discomfort. But a warmer afternoon did not guarantee a warm night. Chinook conditions could weaken, shift, or disappear, allowing cold to return over ground that had recently thawed. Damp insulation then became more dangerous because water conducted heat away faster than dry trapped air and could freeze within the material. This was the deeper rule beneath the robes. Dryness preserved options. A dry layer could remain under the body, cover it, travel with it, or be packed when camp moved. A wet layer demanded attention. It became heavier, colder, slower to prepare, and harder to trust. The family was not merely defending sleep from the frozen earth, it was defending valuable materials from being captured by water. By the time the warm wind reached its fullest strength, the floor might already have been rearranged in small ways that no visitor considered worth recording. A robe lifted, a damp patch exposed, loose bedding renewed where material allowed, traffic redirected around a sleeping place. Each act was modest. Together they kept the household from discovering, after darkness returned, that the comfortable layer beneath everyone had quietly changed sides. The first sign of that change might not have been a visible puddle. It could have been a draft moving differently along the lodge wall, a robe that no longer felt dry underneath, or smoke hanging lower than it had an hour before. The floor and the air were connected. Once the wind changed, the whole interior changed with it. A teepee worked because it guided movement rather than trying to stop it completely. Winds struck the outer cover, slipped around the base, entered through controlled gaps, and rose toward the smoke opening. The liner helped shape that motion by creating a channel between itself and the outer cover. Warm air from the fire rose through the center. Cooler air moved along the lower edge. When everything was balanced, smoke lifted and the people below could breathe more comfortably. That balance was never automatic. Smoke flaps had to respond to wind direction. The fire had to be large enough to warm and draw, but not so large that it wasted fuel or filled the lodge with heat no one could use. Openings near the ground admitted air, but too much low air could become a cutting draft. Too little could weaken the upward pull. The teepee was an elegant structure, though elegance in this case still required somebody to keep paying attention. A Chinook complicated the calculation because it could arrive from the mountains with strength and speed. The air outside became warmer and drier, but the ground beneath the lodge did not change at the same rate. Snow near the outer edge might melt first, frozen soil could soften in patches, moisture could collect where the floor sloped slightly, while the fire continued warming the center. The household was suddenly living over several different surfaces at once. Near the hearth, the earth might remain comparatively dry because of heat and constant traffic. Along the wall, colder ground and meltwater could persist. Near the doorway, dampness arrived on feet and clothing. A sleeping place that had been comfortable during deep cold could become the wrong place once the thaw began. Moving bedding a short distance might matter more than adding another robe. This is where the teepee's circular interior becomes important. People did not use the space randomly. The fire occupied the center. Sleeping and sitting areas generally followed the outer wall, with household possessions arranged according to use, safety, and custom. Exact layouts varied, and surviving descriptions often reflect particular observers or later periods. Still, the arrangement created a practical map. The warm center, the cooler edge, the entrance path, and the smoke line each placed different demands on the people inside. A child sleeping close to the wall experienced the lodge differently from an adult tending the fire. An older person might need protection from both cold ground and an irritating draft. Someone preparing food needed room near the hearth, but also had to avoid bedding, sparks, and passing feet. The best place in the lodge was therefore not simply the warmest. It was the place where warmth, dryness, smoke, movement, and household need interfered with one another the least. That sounds almost modern, until you remember that the floor itself could be rolled up and carried away. Mobility shaped every domestic decision. Materials placed beneath a sleeper had to work in camp, survive packing, travel, and be useful again after the next lodge was raised. Heavy, waterlogged bedding was inconvenient before anyone considered the cold. It took longer to handle, added weight, and risked remaining damp when the household moved. Keeping the floor layers dry protected both the night's sleep and the next day's mobility. The lodge cover followed the same logic. Before canvas became widespread, teepee covers were made from carefully prepared hides sewn together. Those covers represented enormous labour. They were not disposable weather shells. Poles, covers, liners, robes, containers, clothing, tools, and food stores all belonged to one moving household system. A poor decision inside the lodge could affect travel outside it. This was especially true for firewood. Winter warmth depended on fuel that had to be found, cut or broken, carried, kept usable, and fed into the hearth. In sheltered river valleys and wooded wintering areas, fuel might be more available than on the open plains, but it still required labour. A sudden warm spell could tempt a family to reduce the fire, which saved fuel. Yet if the floor began to dampen, some warmth and airflow remained useful for drying. The household had to decide how much fuel to spend against a problem that might disappear by morning, or return as ice by night. There was no reason to imagine this as a formal meeting around the flames. Practical households rarely announce every calculation. A person notices that smoke is slow to rise. Someone adjusts a flap or the fire. A robe is shifted. A child is told to stay off one wet place. Fuel is added carefully rather than dramatically. Domestic intelligence often looks like a series of small corrections made before anyone else realizes there was a problem. The liner helped protect people near the wall, but it could not keep a wet floor dry by itself. Its value lay in reducing drafts and supporting airflow. That distinction matters because later descriptions sometimes make teepee engineering sound almost magical, as though the structure solved every climate problem once the poles were tied correctly. The structure created options. Human judgment selected among them. Wind direction could also change the meaning of the entrance. A low doorway reduced heat loss compared with a broad open entrance, but every opening remained a weak point. If the wind pressed directly toward it, cold or damp air entered more aggressively. If the lodge was oriented and adjusted well for prevailing conditions, the entrance could be less exposed. Yet a sudden shift meant yesterday's sensible arrangement might become today's irritation. The smoke flaps offered another layer of control. By setting them to work with the wind, the household could improve the draw above the fire. This did not guarantee a perfectly smoke-free interior. Wind could be unstable, fuel could burn unevenly, and the number of people inside affected the air. Still, the ability to adjust the top of the lodge gave the family a practical response that a fixed roof could not provide as quickly. The fire itself was never only a heater. It produced light, cooked food, dried objects, and organized the room. People faced it, passed around it, and measured distance from it. During a Chinook, the fire's drying value could become more important, while its heating value seemed less urgent. That shift changed the room without moving the hearth at all. A damp robe placed too close risked sparks or scorching. Left too far away, it dried slowly. Spread where people needed to pass, it disrupted movement. Folded while still wet, it trapped the problem. Every choice created another small inconvenience, which is how history usually reveals the difference between having a useful object and having time to use it properly. The floor layers therefore belong to a larger choreography. Wind entered low, smoke rose high, heat spread outward, moisture moved sideways. People adjusted between them. The family did not defeat the Chinook. It kept redistributing its effects until the lodge remained livable. By late evening, the warm wind might still be pressing against the cover, making the hide or canvas tremble softly. Inside, the fire burned lower. The smoke path held. Bedding near the wall had been checked again. The lodge seemed calm, but that calm was not stillness. It was the result of many tiny movements, each one keeping air above, water below, and sleeping bodies somewhere safely between them. Between the sleeping bodies and the moving air, the floor remained the slowest part of the lodge to respond. Wind could change in minutes, smoke could be redirected with an adjustment above, a fire could be fed or allowed to settle. Dampness beneath the robe moved at its own pace, spreading through pressure, contact, and the small channels left by uneven ground. That made morning inspection important, even when no one would have called it an inspection. Bedding was lifted because it needed shaking. A hide was moved because someone wanted the space beneath it. Loose grass or another plant layer became visible for a moment, and its condition could be judged. Dry materials sprang back slightly. Flattened materials stayed low. Damp material clung together, darkened, or felt colder in the hand. None of these signs required a scientific vocabulary. They required repetition. The person who had slept on the floor knew how it should feel when working well. The person responsible for arranging the lodge knew which edge usually cooled first. A child could see that one bundle was being carried toward drier air, while another remained in place. Knowledge accumulated through chores that looked too ordinary for most written observers to record. The work also had a sequence. Before bedding could dry, it had to be exposed. Before the lower layer could be renewed, the robes above it had to be moved somewhere safe. Before that space could be cleared, containers, tools, clothing, and people had to shift. A problem covering only a few feet of ground could temporarily reorganize the whole lodge. This is where the circular room showed both its efficiency and its limits. Everything useful was close. The fire, bedding, food equipment, clothing, and stored possessions could all be reached without crossing a large building. Yet closeness meant that one activity interfered with another. Drying a robe reduced sitting space. Preparing food narrowed the path around the hearth. Children and dogs, where present, contributed their own highly respected opinions about floor organization, mostly by standing in the wrong place. The humor disappears quickly when we remember the value of the materials being handled. A well-prepared robe represented an animal, skilled processing, time, physical effort, and many possible uses. Hides and robes could warm a sleeper, wrap a traveler, cushion a rider, or enter trade. Allowing one to remain wet was not like leaving a cheap towel on a bathroom floor. It risked damaging a household resource that could not be casually replaced. The plant material below had a different value. It might be locally available and renewable, depending on the campsite and season, but gathering it still cost time and labour. Snow cover could make dry grass harder to find. A Chinook might expose patches that had been buried, yet newly uncovered material was not automatically dry. The same warm wind that opened the landscape could release water across it. A family therefore had to read more than the lodge interior. The country outside supplied the floor. Valleys, river bottoms, prairie grasses, wooded shelter, snow depth, and the condition of nearby ground all shaped what could be gathered or replaced. Floor insulation began before anything was carried through the doorway. It began with knowing where suitable material might still be found in winter. Blackfeet's seasonal movement was built around a broad knowledge of land, animals, water, fuel, and shelter. Winter camps were commonly associated with more protected locations, including river valleys and wooded areas, though circumstances varied. Such places reduced exposure and offered resources, but protection was never complete. A valley could shelter a lodge from one wind while channeling another. Trees could provide fuel and windbreaks while shade preserved cold ground longer. The Chinook crossed those local differences unevenly. Snow disappeared first from exposed ridges and wind-scoured patches. Sheltered hollows might remain frozen. South-facing ground could soften while shaded earth stayed hard. Even within one camp, neighbouring lodges might experience different drainage. The title's sudden wind was regional, but the wet patch beneath a bed was intensely local. Choosing where to raise a lodge therefore mattered before the first floor layer was spread. Ground that appeared level could contain shallow depressions. A slight slope might help water move away, while a hollow could collect it. Families with long experience in a place could know its habits. A newly used campsite demanded closer observation. We should avoid imagining a formal engineering survey. but we should also avoid imagining random placement. People who repeatedly lived on the ground became skilled readers of it. The lodge's stakes and cover met that ground at the perimeter. Snow could be banked around the lower edge in cold conditions to reduce drafts, a practice known across parts of the plains, though the exact use varied. During rapid warming, that bank could become a source of meltwater. What had helped seal the lodge against cold might now hold moisture near the cover. A good solution under one weather pattern could become a problem under another. That reversal is the real character of Chinook weather. It did not merely raise the temperature, it changed the meaning of previous decisions. Thick snow that had insulated the ground became water. A tightly protected edge became a damp boundary. Heavy bedding that had defeated deep cold became harder to dry. The household had to revise yesterday's wisdom without treating yesterday's wisdom as foolish. This distinction matters because indigenous environmental knowledge is sometimes described as if it were a collection of perfect answers. In reality, knowledge includes recognizing when an answer has expired. The skilled response is not always predicting every change. It is noticing quickly, adjusting materials, and preserving enough flexibility to respond again. Inside the lodge, that flexibility appeared in movable layers. A robe could be folded back. A hide could be shifted nearer the center for a time. Loose bedding could be separated, so air reached it. The fire could be maintained at a useful level without being turned into an indoor bonfire. Openings and smoke flaps could be managed according to wind. Each adjustment affected the others, so the work moved in circles around the hearth. The burden of that work was not distributed invisibly, even if many records make it seem so. Women's responsibility for lodge furnishings and hide work meant that weather entered an already crowded field of labour. Food preparation did not pause because bedding needed attention. Clothing repair did not vanish. Children still required care. A thaw added tasks rather than replacing them. Girls growing into these responsibilities would have learnt through participation, watching when materials were moved and helping with work appropriate to age and circumstance. Boys also lived inside the same practical system and could assist with fuel, animals, carrying, or other household needs. Exact divisions changed by family and moment. The larger point is that winter comfort was produced collectively, though particular forms of knowledge and responsibility were strongly gendered. By afternoon, robes might hang or lie where warmer moving air could reach them. The floor beneath could be opened long enough to release trapped dampness. Outside, bare patches spread through the snow. Water traced shallow paths between lodges. The camp looked less severe than it had the day before, but the work inside had increased. Then the sun lowered behind the mountains, and the warm wind began to lose some of its force. The exposed floor layer had become lighter and drier, though perhaps not completely. Bedding had to return to its place before the lodge cooled. Every piece was laid down with a question attached to it. Had enough moisture left? Or had the day only hidden the cold that would rise through it after dark? The answer depended on who would sleep there, and on what the household could spare. A layer that felt almost dry to an adult might still be too cold for a small child or an older person whose body produced less heat through the night. A robe that could be risked beneath one sleeper might be too valuable to place over a doubtful patch of ground. The floor was asking a social question now, not only a thermal one. Who received the driest place, the thickest covering, and the least interrupted sleep? No surviving record gives us the private discussion inside every Blackfeet lodge. It would be wrong to invent a fixed rule in which comfort was always distributed by age, rank, affection, or need. Yet households everywhere must allocate limited materials, and Blackfeet families were working with objects that carried many duties at once. A buffalo robe could not be under two people in different places. A dry hide used as padding could not simultaneously wrap someone travelling outside. Every choice closed another possibility. The people most familiar with the lodge furnishings were therefore making decisions about more than tidiness. Blackfeet women performed much of the labour involved in preparing hides, making and maintaining lodge equipment, arranging domestic space, preparing food, and caring for children. These responsibilities varied with household circumstances and changed across time, but they placed women close to the practical evidence. They knew which robe had absorbed moisture, Which seam needed attention, which sleeping place had become unreliable, and how much work remained before darkness settled fully. That knowledge could be easy for an outsider to mistake for instinct. It was skill built through repetition. A hand pressed into grass and judged whether it had enough spring left to hold air. A robe was lifted by one corner and tested for weight. The lower surface was checked rather than the warmer upper side. Someone watched how the firelight reflected from damp hide, or noticed that a familiar smell had sharpened after the thaw. None of these actions needed to be dramatic to be exact. The household's wealth shaped the margin for error. Horses, robes, lodge coverings, tools, food stores, and trade goods were not distributed evenly among Blackfeet families. Success in hunting, kin connections, exchange, inheritance, loss, illness, and colonial disruption could all affect what a household possessed. A family with more bedding could rotate damp pieces and preserve a dry sleeping layer. A family with fewer materials had to make each one serve longer. That difference rarely appeared as a neat line between comfort and misery. It appeared as time. One household could set a questionable robe aside. Another had to keep working it near the fire. One could spread sleeping bodies further apart. Another placed people closer, sharing warmth while accepting more compression beneath them. Poverty often makes an object perform several jobs without giving it enough time to recover from any of them, which is a sentence that remains annoyingly current. Children added their own pressure to the arrangement. They needed warmth, but they also moved through the lodge, carried snow or damp soil from the entrance, disturbed loose bedding, and required adults to notice problems before discomfort became serious. Their education in winter living happened through this closeness. They saw the floor opened, materials shaken, and wet items kept away from dry ones. They learned that warmth was something a family produced through work, rather than something the teepee supplied by itself. Older children could assist by carrying light materials, watching younger ones, collecting suitable grass when conditions allowed, tending small tasks near the hearth, or helping move possessions out of the way. We cannot assume identical duties in every lodge, and age, gender, family structure, and immediate need all mattered. Still, participation made knowledge durable. The lessons stayed in the hands because the hands had helped. Men's labour also entered the floor in indirect ways. Hunting supplied hides and food. Cutting or gathering fuel sustained the fire. Caring for horses and assessing travel conditions affected whether the camp remained or moved. Lodge life was not divided into sealed departments where one person handled weather and another handled survival. The tasks met beneath the roof, and the success of one changed the burden of the others. If hunting had been poor, a family might have fewer good robes or less food energy available to bodies resisting cold. If fuel was difficult to obtain, drying material beside the fire cost more. If a horse was weak or lost, transporting heavy damp possessions became a greater concern. Floor insulation looked like a local domestic matter, but its condition reflected hunting, labour, mobility, and the larger material health of the household. The Chinook exposed those connections because it compressed decisions into a short period. During stable cold, a dry floor arrangement could remain dependable with ordinary maintenance. Rapid warming demanded inspection. A later freeze demanded that the inspection be correct. The family was not simply reacting to the temperature at that moment. It was preparing for the next change without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Outside, the snow's surface could become soft and uneven. Water gathered where hoofprints, footpaths, and shallow hollows gave it room. Horses benefited from exposed forage in some circumstances. One reason warm winds could be welcomed, but ice and renewed cold could complicate movement afterward. The same weather that opened grass to animals could close moisture inside bedding. Relief and risk travelled together. Inside, the driest sleeping places became a kind of temporary household resource. People could be moved closer to the centre without blocking the hearth. Bedding could overlap, so shared body heat did more work. Damp pieces might be reserved for daytime use or placed where moving air reached them. Valuable robes could be protected by putting less vulnerable material underneath, when such material was available. These are reasonable responses to the physical problem, but the records do not let us declare a single required sequence. Flexibility, rather than one formula, was the stronger technology. That flexibility depended on cooperation. A robe large enough to warm several people was awkward for one person to shake inside a furnished lodge. Clearing the floor took hands and attention. Someone had to keep the fire safe while material moved around it. Someone had to prevent a toddler, a dog, or a loose spark from improving the situation in the worst possible direction. The work also revealed authority. The person responsible for the lodge interior could direct where things went, which bedding was moved, and when a sleeping place was ready again. Domestic authority does not always arrive with a public title. Sometimes it appears as everyone stepping aside because one person has already noticed what the floor is doing. By full darkness, the lodge had settled into a revised pattern. One sleeping place lay slightly nearer the fire. A robe that had seemed dry at noon remained raised for more air. The traffic path from the entrance curved away from the clean bedding. Bodies gathered into the spaces judged safest for the night. Then the wind weakened against the cover. The sound changed from a steady pressure to uncertain gusts, with quieter intervals between them. In those intervals, cold began returning to the ground outside. The family had already divided the dry layers, spent the fuel, and chosen where each person would lie. The next test would not be whether the teepee could hold warmth in general, it would be whether those small household decisions could hold it until morning. The cold did not need to arrive as a dramatic wall of air. It could begin as a stiffness along the outer edge of the lodge, where the ground lost the warmth it had borrowed during the day. A damp patch that felt merely cool at sunset could become firm after midnight. Grass that had held moisture might flatten into a colder layer. A hide placed over it would slow the change from being noticed, but it could not stop the change itself. This was why the evening arrangement mattered so much. Once everyone had settled, repairing the floor became harder. Bedding overlapped. Bodies shared warmth. Possessions occupied the remaining space. The fire burned lower to conserve fuel and allow sleep. Discovering a wet place then meant waking people, lifting heavy robes, and exposing the ground while cold air moved through the opening created beneath them. A careful household tried to make those corrections before they became necessary. The driest material went where the longest contact with the body would occur. Questionable layers could be placed closer to the surface for further checking, rather than buried beneath valuable bedding. The edge nearest the lodge wall received attention because it faced colder ground and lower moving air. The arrangement was temporary, but temporary did not mean careless. Sleeping close together offered one answer to limited insulation. Shared body heat reduced the area of floor that needed the best protection, and overlapping robes could cover more than one person. Families across many cold climates have used that simple advantage. In a Blackfeet lodge, where the circular space naturally gathered people around the hearth, closeness also fitted the architecture. Yet it brought its own small negotiations: elbows, restless children, uneven blankets, and the ancient mystery of how one person can occupy most of a robe while technically remaining asleep. The fire could not solve every problem, though it helped hold the system together. Its radiant warmth reached faces, hands, clothing, and the upper surfaces of bedding. It warmed air rising through the lodge and supported the draft that carried smoke upward. It could help dry small objects placed at a sensible distance. What it could not do was heat the entire earth beneath the lodge evenly, or remove moisture sealed beneath compressed layers. Adding more fuel might make the center uncomfortably hot while the outer floor remained cold. A large fire increased the risk of sparks and consumed wood that had required labor to gather. If the smoke flaps were poorly adjusted to the shifting wind, extra flame could produce extra smoke rather than extra comfort. The solution was rarely the largest possible fire. It was a steady fire matched to airflow, fuel supply, and the condition of the lodge. Someone might remain wakeful longer than the others to watch it, though the surviving evidence does not justify assigning a universal formal night watch inside every Blackfeet household. Fires often needed attention. Children woke, weather changed, and adults slept lightly when conditions demanded it. Practical vigilance could pass from one waking person to another without becoming a named institution. That vigilance included listening. The lodge cover made the wind audible. A steady pressure produced one sound, a loose flap. Changing direction, or sudden gas produced another. Firewood settled with a small collapse. A spark landed where it should not. A horse moved outside. Meltwater that had run freely during the afternoon might stop as the temperature fell. The night announced its changes indirectly, and experienced listeners knew which sounds deserved movement. The floor announced itself through the body. A shoulder remained warm beneath a robe, while the hip below grew cold. A foot found a place where the bedding had shifted apart. A child curled more tightly or moved toward another sleeper. None of these reactions prove an exact recorded routine, but they reveal the physical logic that every floor arrangement had to answer. Cold ground worked upward through contact, and bodies responded before anyone measured the temperature. The youngest sleepers were especially dependent on adults recognizing these signs. Small bodies lost heat faster, and children might not explain discomfort clearly before becoming restless. An older person or someone weakened by illness could face similar difficulty. The warmest position therefore carried moral weight as well as practical value. Household survival was never only the preservation of objects. The objects mattered because particular bodies depended on them. That dependency could strengthen kinship while increasing labor. A parent or older relative shifted a robe, drew a child closer, or gave up a warmer edge. Someone added fuel and checked the smoke. Another person made room without fully waking. These are plausible movements rather than preserved scenes, and the distinction matters. The historical truth lies in the pressure. Limited dry bedding had to be arranged around bodies with unequal needs. The Chinook made those inequalities more visible because it damaged certainty. During steady cold, everyone understood the basic enemy. The ground was frozen, the wind was cold, and insulation had one obvious purpose. During a thaw followed by renewed freezing, the warm day could conceal the night's danger. One sleeping place retained dryness, another held water beneath its surface. The family had to trust judgment gathered through touch, smell, weight, and memory. Material knowledge also included knowing when not to use something. Freshly exposed grass outside might look available after snow melted, but it could carry surface moisture. A hide that felt warm near the fire might remain damp on the side turned away from it. Folding such material too soon trapped the problem. Placing it beneath a sleeper transferred the problem to the floor. Patience became part of insulation, which is inconvenient because patience produces no visible pile of extra blankets. Morning mobility remained in the background of every choice. If the camp needed to move, bedding had to be packed. Dry robes could be folded, bundled, and transported more easily. Frozen or wet materials added weight and could be damaged by repeated thawing and freezing. Even when no immediate move was planned, preserving portability was sensible in a society whose household architecture was designed to travel. The teepee's strength lay in this relationship between permanence and change. It created a recognizable home, hearth in the center, family places around it, possessions ordered within reach. At the same time, every element could be taken apart. Poles came down, coverings folded, bedding rolled, the floor returned to the earth. Domestic comfort had to be built without pretending the household would remain forever on that exact patch of ground. By the coldest hours before dawn, the day's Chinook had become almost an absence, remembered in the dampness it left behind. The lodge cover still moved, but the air entering low was colder now. The fire showed red beneath darkened wood. Under the sleepers, the revised layers either held or failed in small places. A hand reached down once more, pressing beside the body rather than trusting the warmth above. The surface felt dry, deeper underneath. The material remained cool but no longer wet enough to threaten the bedding. That was not victory over the mountain wind, it was something quieter. The household had carried warmth through the part of the night when yesterday's thaw tried to become tomorrow's frozen floor. Morning revealed which parts of that floor had held and which had merely delayed the cold. A dry robe lifted cleanly. A damp one resisted slightly where frost had formed beneath it. Loose grass that had trapped air the day before might now feel stiff in patches, its fibres joined by thin ice. The failure was rarely dramatic. It appeared as extra weight, a hard edge, or a pale crust close to the ground. The first task was to separate what could recover from what had to be replaced. Sunlight, moving air, and the renewed fire could help, but only if the materials were opened and exposed. A frozen fold left untouched would soften later and release its moisture back into the bedding. A robe shaken too close to the hearth could send dust and fragments toward food or flame. Drying required space, and space inside a winter lodge was already employed full-time. Possessions shifted toward the wall, while bedding moved nearer the centre. Containers were lifted. Clothing bundles were protected from the damp area. A path had to remain open between the doorway and the fire. Someone still needed to prepare food. Domestic engineering is often the art of repairing one problem without placing 3 new ones exactly where everyone walks. The hard patch beneath the bedding also revealed the shape of the earth more clearly. A shallow hollow that had been invisible under snow now held refrozen water. A slight rise remained comparatively dry. The floor was becoming a map of the campsite, drawn in cold rather than ink. Once that map appeared, the family could decide whether the arrangement could be repaired or whether the ground itself had become the wrong place to sleep. A small problem might be handled by shifting the sleeping area. The circular lodge allowed some adjustment, though fire, entrance, storage, and the places of other people limited the options. A larger wet section created a harder choice. Materials could be renewed, the ground could be given time to dry, or the lodge might eventually need to be moved a short distance if conditions and the wider camp allowed. We should not imagine that every thaw caused an immediate relocation. Taking down a teepee was skilled work, but it was still work, and winter households did not move simply because one corner had become inconvenient. Yet mobility remained a real advantage. A fixed house must endure the ground beneath it. A teepee could leave. That possibility changed how failure was understood. The floor did not need to become permanent. It needed to remain usable for as long as the camp remained useful. When fuel, forage, shelter, water, hunting, drainage, and weather no longer balanced well enough, the household system could be rebuilt elsewhere. This balance extended beyond one family. Blackfeet winter camps brought related households into patterns of proximity, cooperation, visiting, exchange, and shared knowledge. The exact arrangement of lodges varied, as did the size and circumstances of camps. Still, a household did not face every material problem alone. Kin could lend labour, offer information about drier ground, help move equipment, or share resources when relationships and supplies permitted. Such support should not be romanticised into endless abundance. A robe loaned to another household was unavailable at home. Dry grass gathered from a promising patch might be limited. Fuel cost, effort. Several families could be responding to the same thaw at once. Cooperation existed inside material limits, and generosity carried weight precisely because useful objects were valuable. A visitor entering during this morning work might see robes raised, bedding opened, and people moving around the hearth. Without knowing about the thaw, the scene could look like routine cleaning. In one sense, it was routine. Weather management belonged inside ordinary domestic maintenance. The difference between routine and emergency was often only how quickly the work had to be done. This helps explain why dramatic historical accounts tell us so little about floors, traders, soldiers, missionaries, and later ethnographers were more likely to describe the visible form of the teepee, the painted cover, the arrangement of poles, or the central fire. They were less likely to note who turned a robe, replaced a flattened plant layer, or recognized moisture before it spread. The most important action might be the one that prevented anything memorable from happening. The silence of the record can tempt us in 2 opposite directions. One is to assume that no specialized knowledge existed because outsiders did not describe it. The other is to invent a beautifully detailed procedure and place it into every Blackfeet lodge. Both approaches erase the actual intelligence of the household. The safer picture is flexible practice built from known materials, close observation, repeated experience, and decisions shaped by each campsite. A woman lifting the final robe did not need to follow a universal rule for the act to carry expertise. She needed to know what dry hide felt like, how frost formed beneath compressed bedding, how much fuel remained, when the wind might return, and whether the ground could be trusted for another night. That combination of knowledge was specific, even when the written record remained general. Children learned from the same incomplete morning. One might be asked to carry loose material outside. Another kept a younger child away from the exposed cold patch. A pair of hands held one end of a robe, while an adult shook the other. The task turned weather into instruction. The ground had changed, so the room had to change with it. By midday, the Chinook might strengthen again. Frost beneath the bedding softened. The lodge edge began to drip. Yesterday's problem returned in a new form, which feels unfair until we remember that weather has never shown much interest in finishing one lesson before beginning the next. The household could not simply dry everything once and declare success. It had to keep materials moving through cycles of use, exposure, drying, and protection. Repeated thawing and freezing also threatened the camp's paths. Hard morning surfaces softened under feet and hooves, then froze into uneven ridges. Bringing fuel or water into the lodge became messier. Moisture arrived on footwear even when the sleeping area itself had been repaired. The floor's protection therefore depended partly on behavior at the entrance, clearing snow, controlling traffic, and keeping wet movement from spreading across the lodge. No single barrier solved this. The entrance path, the fire, the lining, the robe layers, the plant bedding, and the choice of ground all shared the work. Remove one, and the others carried more pressure. That was the quiet sophistication of the system. It did not rely on one miraculous material. It relied on several imperfect materials, arranged so that each reduced the failure of another. By afternoon, the exposed hollow had begun to dry at its edges. The family could cover it again, avoid it, or mark it mentally as the place where cold would return first. The floor now held a history of the last 2 days. Compressed grass, a shifted sleeping place, a path curved away from dampness, and one patch of earth no longer trusted. The warm wind was still outside, but it had entered the household as a decision about where a body could safely lie. By the next night, that decision would become something larger. The family would have to judge whether it was still managing the floor, or whether the floor had begun managing the family. The answer did not come from the cold patch alone. It came from everything gathered around it. The fuel remaining beside the hearth, the condition of the horses, the depth of snow beyond the camp, the availability of drier ground, and the work already waiting for the household. A floor could be repaired. The harder question was whether repairing it still made sense. The layers beneath the bedding had seemed to offer a defense against frozen earth. Their wider value appeared only when the ground became unreliable. They preserved choice. Dry grass, hides, and robes allowed people to sleep, recover, pack, and move. Once those materials became trapped in repeated cycles of dampness and frost, the household lost more than warmth. It lost time, labour, carrying capacity, and freedom to respond to whatever the wider winter demanded. The small hollow beside the lodge wall therefore belonged to a much larger map. A family might be near sheltered timber, dependable water, and grazing exposed by the warm wind. Hunting conditions might favour remaining. Relatives nearby might make the camp valuable in ways no dry patch of ground could replace. Moving the lodge could solve one problem while creating several others, including a longer walk for fuel, greater exposure to wind, or separation from useful help. Remaining also carried a cost. Every morning spent lifting bedding was time unavailable for food preparation, hide work, clothing repair, caring for children, gathering fuel, or maintaining equipment. If the ground repeatedly softened and froze, those costs accumulated quietly. A floor did not need to become uninhabitable all at once. It only needed to demand more work each day than the place returned in shelter and resources. This kind of calculation rarely survives in written accounts because it leaves no dramatic object behind. A visitor could record the number of lodges, describe a painted cover, or note the presence of buffalo robes. The moment when a household decided that a campsite had become too troublesome might appear only as movement the next day. The record sees a camp depart. It does not always see the damp corner that helped make departure reasonable. Blackfeet mobility was not wandering without purpose. Bands moved through known country according to season, animals, water, weather, social ties, and opportunity. Exact routes and timing varied. Winter generally encouraged more sheltered locations, while other seasons brought different patterns of movement and gathering. The teepee belonged to that system because it could be dismantled, transported, and raised again, turning household architecture into a practical companion to the land rather than a fixed claim against it. The floor was the most temporary part of that architecture. Poles and covers travelled, robes and containers travelled. The plant layer beneath them might be gathered anew at each site. When the lodge came down, the floor itself stayed behind, flattened grass, a darkened hearth, stake holes, and earth pressed by bodies. Comfort had occupied the place without pretending to own it forever. A Chinook made this temporary relationship visible. The wind could uncover grazing and ease bitter temperatures, offering genuine benefits. It could also send meltwater toward the lodge and weaken the floor's insulating layers. A household did not need to classify the wind as good or bad. It needed to recognize that every benefit rearranged another part of life. Warmer air spared fuel while thawing the ground. Exposed grass helped horses, while wet paths carried moisture indoors. Relief arrived with a maintenance schedule. And history does love a gift with paperwork, even when the paperwork is made of wet robes. At the household level, the person directing the lodge interior had to convert that changing landscape into immediate decisions. Keep this robe dry. Move that sleeping place. Use the remaining loose material where contact with the ground is greatest. Do not waste fuel trying to heat soil that will not stay warm. Preserve the pieces that must travel. These were not isolated tricks. Together they protected the household's ability to act tomorrow. That ability mattered because winter choices could narrow quickly. A family with healthy horses, adequate food, good equipment, and strong kin support possessed more options than one facing illness, poor hunting, loss, or worn lodge materials. The same wet floor could be a nuisance in one household and a serious constraint in another. Environmental skill never erased inequality. It helped people work within the resources they actually had. The difference appeared in labour first. A household with spare robes could rotate them. One with fewer pieces had to dry and reuse the same bedding. A family with enough help could open the floor while other work continued. A smaller or strained household might choose between attending to dampness and completing another urgent task. The weather was shared across the camp, but its cost was divided unevenly. Age divided that cost as well. Children depended on adults to identify cold rising from below. Elders or people in poor health could not simply tolerate a colder place without consequence. Stronger adults might accept the less protected edge, though no universal rule can be claimed. What mattered was that the floor forced the family to translate care into material form. Concern became a robe moved 3 feet, a place surrendered near the fire, or another armful of fuel carried through mud. By late afternoon, the decision to stay could produce a different kind of floor. The unreliable hollow might be left uncovered, and outside the sleeping arrangement, bedding could be concentrated on a smaller area of higher, drier ground. The room became less spacious but more dependable. People sat closer, possessions stacked more tightly. The lodge had not changed size, yet the weather had quietly removed part of it from use. That loss of usable space altered household behaviour. The path around the hearth narrowed. Cooking and drying competed for the same warm zone. A child crossing the lodge had fewer safe steps. Smoke, sparks, bedding, and bodies pressed closer together. Floor insulation had become room management, and room management had become social discipline. Everyone's movement now affected everyone else's comfort. The warm wind outside might make the camp appear open and easy again. Snow withdrew from the grass. Horses stood where forage had emerged. The mountain front sharpened in clearer air. Inside, however, a family could be living in a smaller circle than the day before, organised around the portion of earth still considered trustworthy. As that dry circle shrank, the family's goal narrowed with it. Maximum warmth mattered less than preserving one dependable platform from which every other decision remained possible. Sleep, care, food, work, packing, and movement all began there. Once the dry platform became too small, the question of insulation passed beyond bedding and became a question about the camp itself. Near sunset, someone pressed a palm against the exposed hollow. The surface had softened again under the returning Chinook. It might freeze once more after dark. No robe was placed over it. The empty patch remained visible beside the wall, a small piece of ground excluded from the household. By leaving it bare, the family had admitted something important. Warmth could be rebuilt, but trust in a floor had to be earned one dry night at a time. That trust was never judged in isolation. A family could watch the ground outside its own lodge, but it could also notice what was happening across the camp. One teepee stood over firmer soil, another collected meltwater near its entrance. A third had more shelter from timber, but less sun reaching the ground. The warm wind crossed everyone's camp, yet it did not create the same floor beneath every household. This unevenness made observation social. Someone returning from a neighbouring lodge might mention that the ground there had remained dry. A relative might know of a slightly higher patch nearby. People moving between lodges carried more than conversation. They carried evidence about drainage, wind, snowmelt, and the behaviour of the soil. No formal council had to be called for environmental knowledge to circulate. That does not mean every family followed the same advice. Household needs differed. One lodge might include very young children. Another might be crowded with visitors or relatives. One family had more robes to rotate. Another depended on a smaller set of well-worn materials. A dry patch suitable for a small household might be useless to a larger one. Shared knowledge still had to be translated into local decisions. The camp itself could reveal patterns over several Chinook cycles. Ground near a riverbank might drain well in one place and hold water in another. Snow beneath trees could linger after open ground softened. Wind-scoured ridges might remain drier, but offer less protection from renewed cold. The safest choice was rarely the place with only one advantage. It was the place where several problems remained manageable at once. This is why the household's floor cannot be separated from Blackfeet knowledge of country. The teepee was portable, but portability did not make location unimportant. It made location more important because families repeatedly chose where the lodge would meet the earth. Every camp carried memory of previous camps, which valley held wind, which slope caught sun, where horses found forage, where fuel could be gathered, and where thaw water tended to travel. Such memory was not stored in one person alone. Elders carried long experience. Adults carried the knowledge of recent seasons. Children absorbed place names, routes, signs, and practical habits through participation. Women who managed lodge materials knew how different ground affected bedding. Men working with horses, hunting, and travel conditions knew what the broader landscape was doing. The family's decision emerged where these forms of knowledge overlapped. The overlap could also produce disagreement. A campsite might be good for animals and poor for floors. A sheltered grove might protect people from wind while preserving damp snow. Drier ground might lie farther from water or fuel. One person's solution became another person's extra labour. Environmental knowledge did not remove conflict, it gave the household better terms for understanding it. By this point, the exposed hollow beside the lodge wall had become more than a wet patch. It was a reminder that every convenience had a boundary. The nearby shelter that reduced wind may have slowed drying. The snowbank that blocked drafts may have fed meltwater. The thick bedding that preserved warmth may have concealed moisture. Each good decision carried a point where it stopped being good. A skilled household therefore watched for reversals. The moment when soft snow became water. The moment when water became frost. The moment when a warm robe became a damp weight. The moment when a protected edge became a collection point. This timing mattered more than any single material, because the same object could help in one phase and hinder in the next. Consider the robe again. During deep cold, its thickness reduced heat loss and made the floor bearable. During a thaw, The same thickness could slow drying if moisture reached beneath it. During renewed freezing, that trapped dampness became a colder layer. The robe itself had not changed. The relationship between robe, body, air, and ground had changed around it. That relationship also shaped how quickly people acted. Lifting bedding at the first sign of dampness cost effort, but preserved options. Waiting until moisture spread made every later task harder. The difference might be only an hour or two, which is awkward because history usually preserves wars and treaties more eagerly than the hour when someone correctly decided to move a blanket. The person making that decision needed authority inside the lodge. If bedding had to be raised, others had to move. If part of the floor was declared unusable, sleeping places had to shift. If robes were reserved for drying, someone might accept less comfort. Domestic knowledge became effective only when the household respected the person applying it. Blackfeet women's relationship to Tipi ownership and lodge work gave this authority material force. Historical descriptions often identify women as responsible for the tipi and much of the labour that created and maintained it. Exact arrangements differed by period and family, and later accounts can simplify living practices into fixed gender rules. Even with that caution, the lodge was not merely a place where women performed chores. It was a technical environment in which their decisions shaped everyone's safety and comfort. That expertise included knowing materials over time. A hide might appear sound while its edges weakened. A seam might admit more air after repeated use. A liner might hang differently because it had stretched or become damp. Grass bedding might look plentiful while losing its insulating spring. The household manager was reading wear as carefully as weather. Wear created a historical difference between an ideal tipi and an actual one. Museum displays and illustrations often present the lodge in clean, complete form, evenly placed poles, smooth covering, orderly interior. A winter household lived with patched hides, smoke-darkened surfaces, uneven bedding, repaired cords, and objects serving several jobs. The structure's intelligence was visible most clearly in its ability to remain useful despite imperfection. Trade changed some of those materials. Canvas increasingly replaced hide covers in the 19th century, and cloth entered household use through expanding exchange. Metal tools and manufactured goods altered certain tasks. Yet new materials did not erase the old environmental problem. Canvas still met wind. Cloth still absorbed moisture. Bodies still slept near the ground. A household could adopt new objects while continuing to rely on older knowledge about airflow, placement, drying, and timing. Colonial disruption made that flexibility even more necessary and eventually more constrained. Disease, warfare, the collapse of bison herds, imposed boundaries and reservation policies damaged the material and geographic foundations of Blackfeet life. Access to familiar movement routes, hunting grounds, fuel, and lodge materials was reduced. It would be misleading to treat tipi floor management as a timeless tradition untouched by those pressures. Long before the full force of confinement, however, the practical logic was already clear. A family's warmth depended on freedom to rearrange materials, change the room, seek help, gather replacements, and move when a place no longer worked. Floor insulation succeeded because the household still possessed choices. Outside, the Chinook bent the dry grass now exposed between patches of snow. Inside, the hollow remained bare. No robe covered it, and no sleeper was asked to trust it. The empty space looked like a loss, but it was also evidence of control. The family had not made the ground dry. It had decided exactly how much authority that wet ground would be allowed to have. That authority could be limited most effectively by giving the dampness somewhere specific to go. A household could not order meltwater to disappear, but it could keep wet traffic from wandering through the whole lodge. The entrance, already the point where snow, mud, and cold air arrived, became the obvious place to contain the mess. The driest sleeping space survived partly because another part of the floor was allowed to take the damage. This did not require a built wooden threshold or a modern mat. It required discipline around movement. Wet footwear could be kept near the entrance rather than carried around the hearth. Snow could be brushed away before it melted fully. Damp clothing could be placed where warmth and air reached it without crossing clean bedding. The path inward became narrow and predictable, which is helpful because water behaves badly enough without being given several scenic routes. No surviving account allows us to draw one standard Blackfeet floor plan for a Chinook thaw. Lodge arrangements varied with family size, season, possessions, and individual practice. Yet the physical logic is strong. When the outer edge and entrance carried the highest risk of dampness, protecting the inner sleeping area meant treating the room as a set of zones rather than one continuous carpeted space. The zone nearest the door absorbed inconvenience. It might remain barer, receive worn material, or be cleared more often. The zone around the hearth handled cooking, warming, and drying. The outer sleeping circle required the best separation from cold ground, but only where the soil remained trustworthy. Between these areas, people moved according to rules learned through repetition, rather than signs posted on the wall. A visitor might have seen only a few feet of uncovered earth and assume the household lacked enough bedding. In reality, leaving a patch uncovered could be the more intelligent choice. Bare ground revealed moisture quickly. Covered ground hid it. An empty strip beside the entrance could function as an early warning system, showing whether thaw water had begun entering before it reached the valuable robes. That kind of controlled sacrifice appears in many forms of domestic life. One object wears out, so another lasts. One corner becomes dirty, so the sleeping place remains clean. One adult accepts the draft, so a child stays farther from it. The Blackfeet Lodge made these choices visible, because space was close and every material had a known value. The strategy worked, only while people respected the boundary. A child rushing in with wet feet could cross it in seconds. A visitor unfamiliar with the current arrangement might step onto bedding. A dog could contribute the usual level of administrative confusion. Household authority therefore had to be active, not merely understood once. The floor was managed through repeated correction. Correction could sound ordinary. Stop there. Brush that off. Put this near the fire. Do not set it on the robe. We cannot reconstruct the exact words, and there is no need to. The physical sequence is enough. Wet material paused at the edge. Dry material remained inward. The hearth linked the two by providing controlled warmth, while the liner and smoke opening helped moving air carry moisture away. Crowding made the boundary harder to maintain. Visitors, relatives, or a larger household increased foot traffic and reduced open space. More bodies brought more warmth, which could be welcome, but they also brought more damp clothing, more sleeping pressure, and more competition for dry ground. The same lodge that felt efficient for a small family could become a careful puzzle when several people needed places near the fire. Hospitality and kinship could therefore increase the labour behind comfort. A guest needed room. A relative arriving from outside carried weather on clothing and footwear. Bedding might be shared or rearranged. The household manager had to protect materials without treating people as problems, which is the kind of social engineering no museum diagram of a teepee usually includes. Wealth again altered the available solutions. A household with spare cloth, older hides, or more robes could assign less valuable pieces to the damp edge. One with fewer materials might leave more earth uncovered and rely on stricter movement. Trade cloth could be useful, but cloth that became wet still demanded drying. A new material did not cancel the old problem, it merely joined the list of objects that could absorb water. The entrance boundary also met the weather outside. If meltwater ran toward the doorway, indoor discipline could only do so much. Small changes around the lodge edge, the clearing of slush, or the choice to avoid banking melting snow against a vulnerable area could reduce the pressure, though exact methods would have varied and are poorly recorded. The important principle was to interrupt the path before water reached the sleeping layers. When the wind strengthened, the doorway had to remain useful without becoming an open channel for drafts. When the temperature fell, wet ground near the entrance could harden into an uneven surface. Each adjustment solved only the present version of the problem. That was why flexibility mattered more than a perfect arrangement. A floor plan good at noon could be revised by dusk. The sacrificial zone also protected mobility. Dampness concentrated near the entrance was easier to inspect and manage than moisture spread beneath every robe. Most bedding remained dry enough to roll and transport. Containers and clothing stayed away from the wettest ground. If the camp moved, the household did not begin by packing the weather along with everything else. This was the quiet pressure point beneath the entire system. Warmth could be shared, fuel could be added, bedding could be shifted. But once moisture spread everywhere, options collapsed. Dryness was not merely comfort, it was stored readiness. By evening, the interior might look less balanced than before. One side held concentrated bedding. The entrance area remained comparatively bare. Drying clothing occupied a careful place near the fire. People stepped around the exposed patch as though it were an object. In practice, it had become one, a visible boundary between the part of the lodge given over to weather and the part still reserved for family life. The Chinook pressed softly against the cover again, warmer than the air that had followed it overnight. Outside, snow loosened from the lodge edge. Inside, one muddy footprint stopped near the doorway instead of crossing the room. It was a small success, hardly the sort of event that enters a chronicle. Yet that stopped footprint preserved the dry circle, and the dry circle preserved everything the family might still need to do next. The dry circle could preserve the household's options, but it could not preserve everyone's sleep equally. Someone still had to notice when a child shifted toward the cold edge. Someone had to hear the fire settle, feel the change in the draft, or wake when a damp robe began cooling beneath another sleeper. The floor remained manageable because attention continued after the rest of the lodge grew quiet. That attention carried a bodily cost. A person who rose twice during the night did not begin the morning as rested as the person who remained beneath the warmest robe. Firewood still had to be gathered or brought closer. Food still had to be prepared. Clothing, tools, hides, horses, and children still required care. Weather maintenance did not create a separate day for itself. It borrowed hours from sleep and then expected the usual work to proceed on schedule. Women often carried the largest share of this domestic burden because lodge furnishings, hide preparation, cooking, and much of the organisation of family space fell within their responsibilities. The details varied across households and periods, and no simple division captures every Blackfeet family. Even so, the dry sleeping circle depended heavily on knowledge held through women's repeated work. That knowledge protected others, while the fatigue produced by applying it could remain largely invisible. A robe shifted near midnight is easy to describe in one sentence. Performing the task meant more. The sleeper beside it had to be disturbed. The heavy material had to be lifted without sending sparks or dust toward the hearth. The lower layer had to be checked by touch in dim light. A colder place had to be covered, avoided, or given to the person best able to tolerate it. Then everyone had to settle again, which is often the most ambitious stage of any family operation. Children complicated the night because their comfort could not be measured only by whether they complained. A small child might curl inward, press against another body, or become restless. An adult had to read those movements and decide whether the cause was cold, hunger, smoke, illness, or the ordinary refusal of children to explain anything at the useful moment. The floor added one more possibility to that quiet diagnosis. An older person could face a different pressure. Stiffness, reduced mobility, or poor health could make repeated movement around the lodge difficult. A place near dependable warmth might therefore be preserved for someone who could not easily adjust during the night. We cannot claim a universal rule about who received which position. The point is simpler and more physical. Bodies did not meet the cold with equal strength, so a fair arrangement was not always an equal arrangement. Illness narrowed the household's options further. A person already weakened needed warmth, dry bedding, food, and attention at the same time that others were managing the weather. Dampness beneath a sleeping place could not be dismissed as mild discomfort if the body above it was struggling. The driest robe and most stable patch of ground might then be committed for several days, leaving fewer materials available for everyone else. The household could respond by drawing closer. Shared robes and body heat reduced the amount of protected floor required. Yet crowding also increased disturbance, smoke exposure, and competition for comfortable positions. One restless sleeper affected several others. A cough travelled easily through the lodge. The warmest arrangement could also become the arrangement in which no one had enough room to forget that they possessed knees. Fuel set another limit. A steady fire supported warmth, drying, cooking, and airflow, but every piece of wood represented time and effort outside. During a Chinook, exposed ground might make gathering easier in some places, while mud, ice, and shifting snow made travel awkward in others. If the camp stood near timber, the distance could be manageable. If suitable fuel was scarce, the household had to spend it carefully. The person tending the fire therefore managed a budget measured in heat rather than coins. Burn too much early, and the coldest hours might arrive with less fuel remaining. Burn too little, and damp materials dried slowly while bodies cooled. A poorly placed piece could smoke. A large spark could damage a valuable robe. The fire was generous, but it had the personality of a resource that wanted supervision. Food energy mattered as well. Warm bodies produced heat from what people had eaten. A family facing reduced supplies, poor hunting, or illness had less margin against cold, even if the lodge and bedding were well arranged. Floor insulation could slow heat loss. It could not create strength that hunger had removed. The physical state of the household therefore entered every decision about sleeping places. This makes the phrase "families manage the floor" sound almost too neat. Management suggests calm control. In practice, some nights were probably a series of compromises. One robe not fully dry, one child moved closer, one adult remaining awake longer, one damp corner surrendered, one armful of fuel saved for later. Success could mean that nobody became dangerously cold, even though several people slept poorly. Such success leaves little evidence. A traveller entering the lodge the following afternoon might see dry bedding, a modest fire, and a family carrying on with ordinary tasks. He might praise the teepee's warmth, or record the thickness of a robe. He would not necessarily know who had risen in darkness, who had accepted the colder edge, or which hands had tested the grass beneath everyone before dawn. The surviving record often favours what can be named and collected. It preserves the teepee cover, the painted design, the robe, the tool, and the general description of camp life. Fatigue is harder to place in a museum case. So is the authority required to wake a household and rearrange its sleeping space. The work survives indirectly, inside objects that appear finished and ready for use. By the third night of shifting weather, the family's responses might become faster. The uncertain robe stayed nearer the hearth before anyone lay down. The entrance path remained bare. The youngest sleepers settled within the most dependable circle. Fuel was placed where it could be reached without crossing bedding. Experience had turned the previous night's interruptions into the next night's arrangement. That improvement did not mean the work had vanished. It meant the work had moved earlier, into preparation, where outsiders were even less likely to notice it. A quiet lodge at midnight could be the result of a very busy hour at sunset. Outside, the warm wind weakened once more. Inside, the fire was low but steady. The traffic path was clear, and no one stepped onto the exposed hollow. An adult remained awake long enough to hear the breathing around the hearth settle into an even rhythm. Only then did the last hand withdraw from the edge of the bedding. By morning, an observer might have called the floor dry. The household would have known a more exact truth. It had been kept dry by someone who had not slept quite as deeply as everyone else. The lighter sleep disappeared from the record almost as soon as morning began. A visitor might notice the fire, the robes, or the shape of the lodge. He could count poles, measure a cover, describe the smoke opening, and write down what he thought the family owned. He was much less likely to ask who had awakened during the night, how many times the bedding had been checked, or why one patch of earth remained bare beside the wall. This difference matters because much of what survives about 19th century Blackfeet life was written by people arriving from outside. Traders wanted to understand exchange. Military officers watched movement and power. Missionaries judged belief and domestic behaviour through their own purposes. Ethnographers later tried to preserve knowledge. sometimes with care and sometimes through categories that made a living household seem more fixed than it really was. Each observer saw something useful. None saw everything. Objects survived more easily than decisions. A teepee cover could enter a collection. A robe could be labelled, stored, photographed, and displayed. A scraper or awl could be placed beneath glass. The quick judgment that kept a damp robe away from a child left no separate artifact. It lived briefly in the arrangement of the room, then vanished when the bedding was moved again. That silence can create a misleading picture. We may know that Blackfeet women prepared hides, made lodge coverings and furnishings, organised domestic work, and carried extensive material knowledge. We may know that teepees used adjustable openings, smoke flaps, liners, fires, and portable layers suited to plains life. We may know that Chinook winds can bring rapid warming and dramatic changes in snow. The surviving sources become thinner when we ask for an exact list of actions performed on one wet floor during one sudden thaw. A careless story fills that gap with confidence. It gives every household the same sequence. First, spread this plant, then turn that hide, then move the bedding at a certain hour. The result sounds satisfying because it resembles an instruction manual. It also risks replacing real flexibility with a procedure no source actually preserves. The opposite mistake is equally easy. Because no detailed manual survives, someone might assume there was no specialized response at all. That would ignore the physical intelligence required to live repeatedly in a portable lodge through northern plains winters. People who worked with hides, fire, wind, snow, and soil did not need a written rulebook to recognize moisture, compression, airflow, or renewed freezing. The honest space lies between those two mistakes. We can follow the known materials and the known physics. Dry. Loose layers trap air better than wet, compressed ones. Hides and robes separate bodies from cold ground, but can also hold moisture if the layers beneath them become damp. A liner changes low airflow and reduces direct drafts. A central fire warms unevenly and must work with the smoke opening. Meltwater follows slope, traffic, and the lodge edge. These facts do not reconstruct one family exactly, but they define the problem that family knowledge had to solve. Oral knowledge adds another layer, though outsiders have often treated it as less dependable, simply because it did not resemble their paperwork. Blackfeet teachings about lodges, materials, land, weather, and proper responsibilities were carried through language, demonstration, memory, and participation. Some knowledge was ordinary and practical. Some teepee knowledge was connected to ownership, transferred rights, painted designs, ceremony, and responsibilities that should not be flattened into household trivia. A respectful history does not drag sacred meaning into a technical explanation merely to make the story feel deeper. The floor itself probably belonged mostly to the ordinary side of life, which is exactly why its details could disappear. Ordinary knowledge is repeated so often that no one within the household needs to explain it from the beginning. A child learns by being corrected. A young person learns by carrying, watching, and helping. An experienced adult notices the material before anyone else notices the discomfort. The lesson is preserved in competent action rather than in a speech conveniently delivered for future historians. Later memories also carry the marks of disruption. By the late 19th century, Blackfeet communities had endured epidemics, violence, the destruction of bison herds, shrinking access to land, hunger, reservation confinement, and aggressive efforts to alter family and cultural life. Accounts recorded after these changes may preserve older practices, while also reflecting new materials and restricted circumstances. Canvas, blankets, manufactured tools, and fixed housing entered a world whose earlier seasonal choices had been forcibly narrowed. That means chronology must remain visible, even inside a calm domestic scene. A hide-covered lodge in an earlier bison economy was not materially identical to a canvas teepee used later. A household moving through familiar wintering country did not face the same choices as one confined to limited land. A robe produced within a functioning hunting system carried a different replacement possibility from a robe treasured after the bison economy had been devastated. The title asks how Blackfeet families managed floor insulation during Chinooks, but the answer cannot be lifted from one frozen moment and applied across centuries. Families changed, materials changed, political conditions changed, access to grass, hides, fuel, horses, and camping places changed. The physical challenge remained recognizable, while the resources available to meet it became less secure. Even the word Chinook can encourage a neat modern picture. A named weather event arrives, and the household performs a known response. People living east of the mountains experienced the wind before modern weather services classified it. They recognized its effects through accumulated local knowledge. But that does not mean every warm gust produced the same conditions or the same decisions. Duration, snow depth, ground slope, shade, wind strength, and the cold that followed all mattered. The empty patch by the lodge wall therefore becomes our safest witness. It does not tell us who uncovered it, or the exact words used inside the family. It does not prove that every Blackfeet household created the same bare zone. It simply holds the logic of cautious adaptation. When a material or piece of ground could no longer be trusted, people preserved warmth by refusing to hide the problem. By afternoon, an outsider might have seen that bare earth and written almost nothing about it. Perhaps it looked unfinished. Perhaps it seemed too ordinary to mention. The family living around it would have understood why no robe covered the hollow, why traffic curved away, and why the driest bedding remained tightly gathered elsewhere. The written page kept the tipi. The collection kept the robe. The floor decision survived only as an absence, a small, uncovered place where household knowledge had acted and then left no label behind. That absence would matter even more once the materials themselves began to change, under pressures no Chinook had created. Those pressures reached the floor through objects that looked, at first, like improvements. Canvas covers could be lighter to handle than a full set of hide lodge skins. Manufactured blankets could add warmth. Metal tools could change the speed and ease of certain tasks. Trade cloth, kettles, axes, and other goods entered Blackfeet households through widening networks of exchange. New materials were useful precisely because families judged them by familiar needs: weight, durability, warmth, drying time, repair, transport, and the work required to obtain them. Canvas did not make the tipi cease being a tipi. It changed part of the material equation. A canvas cover could still be raised over the same basic pole structure, adjusted to wind, and used with liners and smoke flaps. It still met snow, rain, sparks, and dust. It still ended at the ground, where the household had to decide how much air to admit and how much moisture to exclude. New fabric altered maintenance, but it did not repeal weather. Blankets also entered a system already organized around hides and robes. They could be layered, folded, shared, carried, and dried. They could supplement older bedding or gradually replace part of it when buffalo robes became harder to obtain. Yet woven cloth behaved differently when wet, and families had to learn those differences through use. A blanket might be easier to fold than a heavy robe, but it could still absorb water and lose comfort against cold ground. Every new object arrived with a period of negotiation. That negotiation became harsher as the bison herds collapsed under commercial slaughter and colonial expansion during the 19th century. For Blackfeet communities, bison were tied to food, clothing, shelter, materials, tools, exchange, and the wider seasonal economy. Their destruction did not merely remove one source of meat or one picturesque feature of Plains life. It damaged the household's ability to replace the very materials that made flexibility possible. A worn robe could once be understood within a living cycle of hunting, preparation, use, repair, exchange, and eventual replacement. As that cycle was broken, the same robe became harder to risk beneath a damp sleeper. A hide damaged by moisture represented a loss that could not be answered in the old way. Scarcity changed the acceptable level of wear, the length of use, and the amount of labor invested in preserving each piece. The floor, therefore, began to hold colonial pressure in quiet form. A blanket issued, traded, purchased, or obtained through new channels might lie where a buffalo robe had once been. Canvas might replace hide above. Access to familiar wintering places might shrink. Fuel, grazing, and suitable camping ground could become harder to choose freely. The household still possessed knowledge, but the range of decisions available to that knowledge was being narrowed. This is an important distinction. When an old response becomes difficult, it does not mean the knowledge behind it has vanished. It may mean the land, animals, materials, or freedom required to apply it have been taken away. A family confined to a smaller area cannot solve poor drainage simply by following the seasonal route that once offered better ground. Skill remains, while permission disappears. Reservation boundaries and government pressure increasingly restricted Blackfeet movement. Hunger, disease, and the destruction of the bison economy weakened households. Policies aimed at changing indigenous housing, labor, education, and family life reached far beyond architecture. Fixed buildings were often presented by officials as evidence of improvement, while the intelligence of mobile life was treated as backward because it did not resemble the officials' own rooms. A wooden floor could appear to solve the cold earth problem by raising sleepers above soil. In some conditions, it did. Fixed houses offered certain kinds of shelter and could be adapted by the people living in them. But a building also fixed the household to one site. Poor drainage beneath it could not be escaped by moving a short distance. Fuel needs changed. Ventilation changed. Crowding, dampness, and repair took new forms. Architecture always trades one set of problems for another. Although governments have a long tradition of describing their preferred problems as civilization, Blackfeet families did not simply abandon one world and enter another overnight. Tipis, cabins, tents, and other forms of shelter could coexist. Families used what was available, what regulations allowed, what seasons required, and what household circumstances made practical. Materials crossed between these settings. A blanket used in a fixed house might later travel. Canvas might be patched and reused. Older knowledge about keeping bedding dry remained useful, even where the floor beneath it had changed. The change in shelter also changed who outsiders thought possessed knowledge. Officials often credited manufactured materials or permanent buildings for any improvement in comfort, while ignoring the Blackfeet decisions that made those materials work. A blanket does not choose where to lie. A stove does not decide when a room needs air. A wooden floor does not keep itself dry. The object receives praise because it can be purchased and counted. The judgment surrounding it disappears again. Inside a teepee during a Chinook thaw, that judgment had been visible in the exposed hollow, the narrowed sleeping circle, and the stopped footprint. Under colonial pressure, the same judgment might appear in a different arrangement. A trade blanket protected from wet ground, canvas lifted for repair, or bedding moved within a cabin where dampness gathered near a wall. The materials changed, but the household still watched the places where warmth leaked away. Scarcity also intensified inequality between families. Those with stronger access to trade, wages, livestock, kin assistance, or government supplies might obtain more blankets or replacement canvas. Others stretched old materials further. A blanket described in an official inventory as one item could mean a spare layer in one household and the only dependable covering in another. Numbers flattened the difference that sleeping bodies felt immediately. Children growing up through these changes learned a mixed material world. They might handle a buffalo robe whose history reached into an older economy, a manufactured blanket obtained through trade or issue, and a canvas lodge cover repaired many times. The lesson was not that one material was purely traditional and another purely foreign. The lesson was which one stayed warm, which one dried, which one tore, which one could be spared, and which one had to last. By then, the Chinook remained what it had always been. Warm air descending from the mountains and changing the snow with unsettling speed. What had changed was the household's margin for response. A family could still lift bedding, manage airflow, protect a dry zone, and read the ground. It might no longer be free to move toward the best winter site or replace damaged layers through a healthy bison economy. The uncovered patch beside the wall now carried a second meaning. Earlier, leaving it bare had shown control over moisture. Under growing colonial restriction, bare ground could also mark a missing option. the dry robe not easily replaced, the campsite not freely chosen, the route no longer open. The floor still told the truth about the weather. It had begun telling the truth about power as well. Power showed itself most clearly in what the family was still allowed to change. A wet patch could be uncovered. A robe could be moved. A fire could be adjusted. A lodge could once be taken down and raised on better ground when the wider needs of the band made movement sensible. Colonial restriction did not erase those skills. It made some of their most effective answers harder, more expensive, or forbidden. That difference matters because adaptation is often praised only after the choices behind it have been removed. Officials could look at a Blackfeet family using canvas, blankets, a cabin, or a stove and describe the scene as progress toward a settled life. The description placed value on the purchased object and ignored the older judgment deciding where the object belonged, how it should be dried, and when the room itself was working against the people inside it. A manufactured blanket did not announce that its lower fold was damp. A wooden wall did not explain why cold collected beside it. A stove did not decide which child needed the closest sleeping place, or whether the room required more air. Those decisions still came from bodies reading materials in real time. The household technology remained partly invisible because it lived in attention rather than machinery. The same was true of the teepee. Outsiders often treated portability as evidence that the shelter was temporary, in the sense of unfinished or inferior. For Blackfeet families, portability could mean the opposite. It allowed a complete domestic space to follow food, water, horses, kin, weather, and ceremony. The lodge was temporary on one piece of earth, because the household itself was durable enough to be rebuilt elsewhere. When that freedom narrowed, the floor acquired a new burden. It had to remain usable even when the site was poor. The stay was longer than desired, or replacement materials were scarce. A family might know that another location offered better drainage and still be unable to choose it. Knowledge could identify the solution, while political power blocked the route toward it. That is a particularly quiet form of pressure. The family does not forget how to read the ground. The ground is simply no longer theirs to leave on the old terms. Under those conditions, maintenance became a way of extending limited choice. Bedding was protected because it might have to last longer. Canvas was patched because another cover could not be assumed. Fuel was rationed because access to timber might be restricted or inconvenient. The driest section of floor was defended because moving the lodge no longer sat among the easy responses. This could make domestic labour appear more successful while actually becoming more demanding. A carefully managed room might remain warm enough. The blankets might look orderly. The floor might appear dry when a visitor entered. What the visitor could not see was the extra hour spent airing material, the repeated repair, or the decision to keep one edge unused because the building or campsite offered no better alternative. A system under strain often survives by transferring cost into labour. The object continues functioning, so the arrangement looks stable. The person maintaining it grows more tired. In Blackfeet households, much of that transferred cost continued to fall on women, whose work connected clothing, food, children, hides, bedding, and the organisation of domestic space. Their expertise allowed families to adapt across severe material change, but expertise should not be confused with unlimited capacity. There were limits to what careful hands could preserve. A robe worn thin could no longer trap the same amount of air. A blanket, repeatedly dampened and dried, could become less pleasant against the body. A canvas cover, patched many times, still admitted weather differently from a newer one. A floor over poorly drained ground remained poorly drained, even when every movable layer above it was arranged with care. The body eventually found those limits. Cold rose through the hip. Smoke irritated the eyes. A child woke. An older sleeper remained stiff after dawn. These were not failures of culture or intelligence. They were evidence that no technology works independently of land, resources, health, and political freedom. The Chinooks sharpened that truth because it changed conditions so quickly. A fixed arrangement could be correct in the morning and wrong by evening. The family needed spare material, time, energy, and permission to respond. Remove any one of those, and the weather gained more authority inside the room. Still, knowledge did not become passive. It could move into altered settings. The habit of checking beneath bedding remained useful on a plank floor, an earthen floor, or a layered tipi floor. The practice of separating wet traffic from sleeping space remained useful wherever snow entered through a doorway. Attention to airflow mattered around a central hearth, a stove, or a crowded room. Old experience did not need to remain attached to one exact object in order to remain alive. This is where the simple language of tradition can mislead. Tradition sounds like repeating the same action because the past commands it. Living knowledge is more demanding. It recognizes the purpose beneath an action and changes the action when materials change. The purpose here was not to preserve one perfect arrangement of grass, hide, and robe forever. It was to maintain a dry, warm, usable place where a household could sleep and rise ready for the next day. That purpose could survive substitution. Grass might give way to another available layer. A buffalo robe might be joined or replaced by trade blankets. Hide covers might give way to canvas. A teepee might stand beside a cabin or return for seasonal use. The form changed, while the questions remained familiar. Where is the cold entering? What is holding moisture? Which layer can be moved? Who needs the safest place? What must remain dry if the family has to travel? Such questions also protected dignity. Colonial observers often reduced indigenous households to measurements of cleanliness, permanence, or conformity. A damp floor could become evidence in someone else's judgment about how people ought to live. The observer rarely measured whether the assigned location drained well, whether promised supplies arrived, or whether the family had been denied access to better resources. Bureaucracy has always enjoyed grading the results of conditions it helped create. Inside the household, the standard was more practical. Did the bedding remain usable? Could children sleep? Could an older person rise without being chilled through the night? Could the materials be packed, repaired, or used again? The answer did not need official approval. It needed to work against the body. By the time another warm wind crossed the foothills, the family might be using a different mix of materials from an earlier generation. The cover sounded different. The blankets folded differently. The available campsite might have been chosen within narrower limits, yet a hand still pressed beneath the sleeping layer rather than trusting the warmth on top. That gesture carried more history than the object alone. It joined weather knowledge, women's labour, family care, material scarcity, and the memory of mobility in one brief test. Dryness meant the night could continue. Dampness meant the arrangement had to change while change was still possible. Outside, the snow withdrew again in ragged lines, exposing grass and dark soil. Inside, the safest sleeping space remained small but intact. The floor had become a record no official had written. One part weather, one part labour, and one part the freedom to decide what could still be moved before the cold returned. That record was rewritten before sunrise, when the coldest air settled low and the warmth of the fire had withdrawn into a red core beneath the ash. The family did not need to uncover the entire floor to know how the night had gone. A hand beneath the nearest edge of bedding, a foot placed on the exposed path, and the feel of the air beside the liner were enough to begin reading the room again. The dependable sleeping circle had done its work. Bodies had remained together over the driest ground. The entrance had taken the mud and melting snow. The hollow beside the wall had stayed uncovered, where its frost could be seen, rather than hidden beneath a valuable robe. Nothing about the arrangement looked grand. Its success was measured by the absence of a crisis. No bedding soaked through, no sleeper forced onto wet ground, no bundle made too heavy to carry. Morning still demanded payment. The person who had slept lightly rose first, or moved first, though the sources do not preserve a name or a universal household order for that moment. The fire needed stirring. Bedding needed opening before body warmth trapped the night's moisture inside it. Footwear near the entrance had to be checked before anyone carried yesterday's thaw across the dry circle. The work began while the lodge remained dim enough that shapes mattered more than colours. A robe lifted from the ground held the temporary shape of the sleepers who had shared it. Beneath it, the plant layer was compressed, but usable. Nearer the wall, a thin whitening of frost showed where moisture had returned. That contrast explained the whole night more clearly than a thermometer could have done. One patch had preserved trapped air, another had surrendered it to water and pressure. The family could now decide what the day required. If the Chinook strengthened again, the bedding would be opened to moving air. If cold held, the driest layers would be returned quickly before they lost warmth. If the camp prepared to move, every robe and blanket would be judged by weight, flexibility, and the possibility of hidden dampness. The floor's condition reached forward into all of those choices. Packing a lodge made the value of dry insulation especially plain. Poles, cover, liners, containers, tools, food, clothing, and bedding formed a load whose parts had to remain manageable. Wet material added weight and delay. Frozen folds resisted rolling. A damp robe packed tightly could carry moisture into the next camp, where the household would begin building warmth with yesterday's problems still inside the bundle. A dry layer, by contrast, preserved speed. It could be shaken, folded, placed with other bedding, and trusted again after the lodge rose elsewhere. This was why the floor had never been a separate domestic detail. It belonged to movement. The place where a family slept at night had to be capable of becoming luggage in the morning. That relationship between sleep and travel was damaged when movement was restricted, but it was not erased from household knowledge. Even when families used canvas, manufactured blankets, cabins, or combinations of older and newer materials, the same practical questions survived. What could be dried? What could be carried? Which object had to last? Which part of the room could be surrendered so the rest remained usable? The questions sound simple because the answers were made through repeated work. They were also deeply historical. They linked the bison economy to bedding, women's labour to architecture, horse mobility to campsite choice, kinship to shared material, and colonial power to the shrinking number of places where a household could choose its ground. All of that could meet beneath one robe without becoming visible to a visitor standing beside the fire. The visitor's account might say that the teepee was warm. It might praise the central hearth or describe the liner. It might note that buffalo robes covered the earth. Those observations were not necessarily false. They were incomplete in the particular way that finished comfort is incomplete. The arrangement looked stable because someone had already responded to every small sign that it was not. No record tells us how many times a particular Blackfeet mother, grandmother, daughter, father, son, or other relative checked a floor during one Chinook night. No honest narration can supply the missing number. We cannot recover the exact words spoken when a child crossed the wet path, or when a robe was shifted toward the hearth. What remains is the material pressure that made such actions reasonable, and the larger body of Blackfeet knowledge that made them possible. The silence does not leave the floor empty. It asks us to look differently at what survived. A worn edge on a robe points toward repeated handling. A teepee liner points toward controlled air. A portable cover points toward planned movement. Grass pressed beneath bedding points toward separation from the earth. The unrecorded maintenance sits between those objects, holding them together like a seam that becomes visible only when it begins to fail. Outside, pale morning light reached the eastern edge of the camp. The mountains behind remained darker, while the open ground showed the mixed work of the Chinook: exposed grass, shallow water, hard patches of refrozen snow, and paths marked by people and horses. The warm wind had not created a gentle spring morning. It had made winter uneven. That unevenness continued beneath the lodge. Near the entrance, one footprint had frozen at its edges. Along the wall, the rejected hollow held a dull skin of ice. Inside the protected circle, the grass beneath the bedding remained loose enough to lift between the fingers. The family had not made the earth uniform. It had kept the differences from spreading into every sleeping place. The fire brightened as air began moving upward again. A robe was turned so its cooler underside faced the warmth. Another was folded because it had passed the morning test. The exposed hollow stayed uncovered. No one needed to pretend that it was usable merely to make the room look complete. Soon the teepee might remain where it stood, or the household might prepare to raise it elsewhere. The records may preserve the camp, the route, the lodge, or the robe, while leaving that decision at floor level unnamed. But the final evidence was there in the arrangement itself. Wet ground given no covering, dry bedding protected from the entrance, and a narrow circle where sleep had lasted through another reversal of the wind. As the light climbed, the last frost softened along the outer edge. Beneath the folded robe, the dry grass slowly rose where the weight of the family had been. Beyond the lodge, the Chinook continued across the foothills. Inside, one small patch of floor still held the shape of the night without holding its water.